So welcome again to Word Crumbs. Today is Thursday of the 19th week in Ordinary Time, and the Gospel passage that the Church proposes to us is Matthew chapter 18, 21, right up to the end of the chapter. Matthew chapter 18, 21, and following. So we are just continuing the reflections based on Matthew 18 during this week in the liturgy of the church, and we were talking about the gift and the task of community, Christian community. And we were invited to ask three questions. What is Christian community all about at the essence? Why do we need to participate, or are we invited as Christians to participate in Christian community? And of course, the how. How can we practice growing in maturity in our relationships through the gift and the task of Christian community? Now, today's passage is a very known passage. I invite you to take up your Bibles and read with me, and we will continue with the reflection. So once again, Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 and following. Then Peter went up to him and said, "Lord, how often must I forgive my brother if he wrongs me? As often as 7 times?" Jesus answered, "Not 7, I tell you, but 77 times." And then he tells this parable. "And so the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who decided to settle his accounts with his servants. When the reckoning began, they brought him a man who owed 10,000 talents. He had no means of paying, so his master gave orders that he should be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, to meet the debt. At this, the servant threw himself down at the master's feet, with the words, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay the whole sum.' And the servant's master felt so sorry for him that he let him go and cancelled the debt. Now as this servant went out, he happened to meet a fellow servant who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him by the throat and began to throttle him, saying, 'Pay what you owe me.' His fellow servant fell at his feet and appealed to him, saying, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you.' But the other would not agree. On the contrary, he had him thrown into prison till he should pay the debt. His fellow servants were deeply distressed when they saw what had happened, and they went to their master and reported the whole affair to him. Then the master sent for the man and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I cancelled all that debt of yours when you appealed to me. Were you not bound then to have pity on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you?' And in his anger, the master handed him over to the torturers till he should pay all his debt. And that is how my heavenly Father will deal with you, unless you each forgive your brother from the heart." Now, perhaps I could even just leave you in silence to pray with this passage, because the message is clear enough, and we've probably heard its explanation many times of how Peter, who is supposed to be the leader of the church, of the Christian community, he's the head. And he asked a question on behalf of the whole community. How many times must I forgive my brother? And he said 7, and it's not too bad. Sometimes we count to 3, no? Once. Second time he's doing the same thing, and third, that's it. No, we're not going to forgive the person or to be able to move on in that relationship. So 7 is quite good. And we know that 7 itself, in a biblical explanation, means infinite already. So 7 is an infinite number of times to forgive, and Peter is already aware of that. And Jesus somehow exaggerates to make a point. Said not just seven, not just an infinite number of times, but 70 times seven. So infinitely infinite number of times should we forgive. And then he tells the parable of the unforgiving debtor to show how God forgives so much, who is the master, in whom all of us owe our debts to, in a sum that is incomparable to what others may owe to us. So there's this comparison of the 10,000 talents as compared to the 100 denarii, which is nothing compared to the 10,000 talents. And so it shows how uh, we as Christians could be very unforgiving to others who have done small things to us when God has forgiven us big things that perhaps we have done against Him, and that we traditionally call sin. So here we can see a certain emphasis of comparing God's forgiveness to our unforgiveness, and how Jesus invites us in faith to take a step to become more like God in forgiveness. And he says here something that is very interesting at the end. He says, this is how you will be treated. It's like a kind of warning. That if we don't forgive, God too will not forgive us. Sometimes we hear, in the Bible version, in this chapter even. But in a certain sense, if we don't forgive, it's hard to experience God's forgiveness as well. If we don't at least make a choice out of faith to forgive somebody else. And Jesus uses the expression here, unless you forgive your brother or sister from the heart. From the heart. Forgiveness not just as an obligation because I'm a Christian, not just as something, okay, so I will perhaps ignore the person from now on. So maybe, all of us fall into this, maybe if I don't see the person so much, then I won't think so much about what the person did to me or the hurts that I have. But Jesus says, forgiving from the heart, from the roots, from the depths of who I believe I am and who I believe the other is. And it's interesting that St. Peter uses the word brother. He doesn't say, how many times should I forgive that guy or that person in the community or etc. He already considers the rest as brothers or sisters. And this is one characteristic also in Christian community in which we're invited to grow, to consider the other as my brother or as my sister. And that's already one big step. So it's not just some unknown person that I can ignore for the rest of my life, even though some of us might do that to our own relatives or our own kin. But it's somebody who is myself, my own, who belongs to me. And so this is a very challenging passage, but it goes to the core of what Christian community is all about, or the core practice in Christian community, which is faith and forgiveness. Okay, these two words that I invite you to ponder on today: faith and forgiveness. That the kind of forgiveness that Jesus is inviting us to is impossible, if we say very difficult, without faith. And today I invite you to ponder what faith is all about. As we read the passages, in order not to get too focused on particular issues or our challenges and problems, it's good to see the whole context of the Gospel of Matthew. If you remember, the steps of Christian community come like this, or rather, the steps of the Gospel of Matthew. First comes faith in the person of Jesus. He calls the disciples, they see his miracles, they hear his teaching. So faith in Jesus. And second step that we see is the feeding of that faith, the feeding of the 5,000, the two miracles of the loaves. After he talks about the kingdom, he shows it through nourishing faith. So first, faith, and then second, the nourishment of faith, and then the third, the practice of Christian community. So let us not lose sight also of the first part. Jesus is not just asking us to forgive by our own human strength, our own human perspective, but with the strength of faith and the strength of the perspective of faith. And what is this faith all about? And this parable that Jesus tells us today gives us a certain key. Now, when he talks about the master, um, and he talks about how the reference point is not just you and the person, or what the person did to you, or sometimes we might have done to the other person, or did not do for each other. That is not the whole point here. If we just focus on what the person did to us, or what we did to others, etc., we will not forgive. Jesus invites us focus on God, on what He does for you, what He does for everybody. And then that will be the key of forgiveness. So faith and forgiveness go together. How does God treat us? Let us focus on that in this act of forgiveness. Now, on this line of faith, I'd like to just share with you a passage in my own personal experience that helps me to understand what it means to forgive from the heart. Because actually, well, just another trivia, if you like, biblical trivia, or of our religion as Christians. They say that some scholars say that there are three main things that distinguish the Christian religion from others. That is more surprising, no, or more how do you say that makes it more special. First is that a God who allows himself to be killed. No other religion shows a God who allows himself to be killed without doing something in return at least, no? So one thing is this God of ours allows himself to be killed, and it's a mystery. And sometimes even for us Christians, it's hard to understand in the practice. Second, he forgives his enemies. And this is a very, very challenging point of our religion as Christians. Forgiving enemies, but first seeing that our God forgave his own enemies, those who hurt him, those who killed him. So first he allows himself to be killed, to be fragile, to be vulnerable as a human being. Second, he forgives those who harm him. And that is super mysterious, okay, for us as Christians, as a mystery, I mean. And thirdly, not just does he allow himself to be hurt, not just does he forgive his enemies, he positively loves them. He does good to his enemies. He just doesn't avoid them and say, okay, let's forget about it. But he actively loves them. And if we are really interested to go deeper in our faith, we really need to ponder these points. Because if we want to forgive from the heart, we have to go to that mystery. Because by ourselves, I think the first one is impossible. The second, we could do it by obligation, if you know what I mean. Because I'm Christian by name, so I have to forgive. Or at least I want to feel good, no? To be at peace, and lack of forgiveness nourishes a kind of lack of peace in ourselves. And if we want peace, we just forgive for the sake of it. But to love positively our enemies is what Jesus means by forgiving them from the heart. To do good for them, not in the sense of condoning the evil that they do or the bad that they may have caused to us, but to love positively, to do something good for them, to help them to change as well, we ourselves first, but to help all of us to change for the better. And that requires a lot of deepening in our faith and prayer. And that is why I said I would like to introduce a little passage that helps me to go deeper in this. Not that I practice it perfectly, but helps me to go deeper, to understand and try to practice it more and more in my own life. When we talk about welcoming the little ones, little not physically or just little children, but little in our own eyes, those of little value for us. This passage helps me. Anyway, It's Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. And I'm sharing this with you because it goes to the core of my experience of why I'm a missionary, or why I've consecrated my whole life to God. Anyway, the passage says, "The life that I now live, I live in faith." And St. Paul continues, "Faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave his life for me." So this passage, if you like to read it and meditate it, is really deep, and it goes really, according to my experience, it goes to the core of our faith. That faith is real. Faith can be lived in fullness, not just halfway. Faith can be lived not just as an obligation or something that is imposed on me, but something that can be experienced as the absolute reality and truth in my life. Faith in what? Faith in the Son of God. That God is real. God exists. And not just that God is real and that God exists, but He's someone, the Son of God. He's someone who loves me, who loves us unconditionally to the point of giving Himself, someone fully holy, for someone unworthy and sinful like me. So this faith in fullness goes in 3 steps according to my experience and what I believe. Faith that God exists, but faith that He is someone, a person that I can relate to. He's a friend, and He's a real friend, as real and more real than anybody in our lives. He's someone I can relate to, I can talk to, who talks to me, who fulfills me. No, faith in someone. And the 3rd step is not just that God exists, not just that He's someone, a person, but this person loves me unconditionally, crazily, illogically, that God loves me. And it's this experience of living the fullness of faith in these 3 steps that makes us see that, yeah, maybe it's the most logical thing as well to love others in the same way. And why did I say that this helps me to love and to forgive from the heart? Because without this experience of being loved in such a way, honestly, I don't see any reason why we should forgive others. As I said, sometimes we forgive just for our own peace of mind. There's some other people who don't need a peace of mind to live. It's not necessary to forgive. It's an act of freedom. It's your own personal choice to forgive. And there's nothing that would motivate our personal choice to forgive if not for that experience of the fullness of faith. That Jesus Christ is someone for me. He's real. He's not just an article of faith. He's not just a teaching, some information that I learned in catechism. He's not just something that I receive in Mass, as something, but he's someone for me, and he's important for me. And because he's so important for me, that's why I forgive. That's why nourishing faith is so important. That's why the most important mission of our church is to nourish faith. And nourishing faith is the most unconditional act of love that I can think of in our world. Because you don't get paid for nourishing faith. Nobody appreciates that in a certain sense, materially. No, nobody pays for being nourished in faith. Who pays to go to church? Which church? Well, which church where we feel free enough to go to makes us pay for the faith. Nourishing is a motherly act, and I think, humanly speaking, the most unconditional acts of love come from mothers. Because why do they love their children? Because they're theirs. That's it. And so really, that's the central mission of our church. The feeding of the 5,000 nourishes our faith, our relationship with God who is love. And the best thing we can do for our enemies, so-called, or people who are little in our sight, is actually to help them to experience this love from God. Our hearts are very small. We're mean people. We are very petty, and we have to accept that. It's okay. But uh, what we can do for others is help them to experience that they are loved by God. We try to show that love by our little hearts, our little efforts, our little love. But it is God's love, that they need to experience by nourishing their faith, by welcoming them. Simply by welcoming them, we don't have to do much. Welcome them uh, as the little ones of God. Learn to pray for them as we are going through this chapter 18 this week. Learn to reason things out with them. Learn to listen to them. Learn to agree through Christian argument, as we were saying yesterday, not just accepting the faults and failures, but with that patience to welcome the little ones. And that leads us to bring them to the Master, who is the one who can release all of us from our debts. So, once again, forgiving from the heart, that is a choice that we have to make. Not a choice of being heroes or super good people, but because faith is someone for us, because faith matters to us, because faith is basically somebody who loves us immensely. It's a mystery, and we want to experience that love for us, through us, for others as well, in us. We want the fullness of faith, and that is what makes us love. The Son of God loved me, He Himself, and gave Himself for me. So let us continue this day asking for these two gifts, no, faith and forgiveness. The forgiveness is not this great difficult thing that Jesus Christ insists that we do because we are Christians, but faith is forgiveness is something that comes from this experience of faith. That first of all, I experience there is someone whom I owe 10,000 talents, not just because of my sin, but because He chooses to love me no matter what. And because of Him, forgiveness comes as the natural option of faith.